every officer pretty much uniform was wearing body-worn camera at this point, especially on roadside stops. So I'd say everything's on video. That's what I expect when someone comes in and meets with me. What I will say is I absolutely agree with you. Why do people do them? I think people want to comply. The officers don't exactly tell you don't have to do it. The way that they ask is the same way that they ask to search your vehicles. I'll start with that. Anything in here illegal, that I should know about? No. That's what everyone says, no, right? Because the answer is always no. And then the officer says, well, you wouldn't mind if I looked then, right? Now, if you say, yeah, I would mind if you looked, you're someone who knows your rights. That's not going to hurt you. But most people default to, no, I don't mind if you look. And that's how they get inside your vehicle. It's the same way with field sobriety. Yeah, you have an athlete drink, you're safe to drive, right? So you don't mind going through a few tests with me over here in front of my vehicle. Just make sure you're safe to drive. Sometimes they say, we're just going to do field sobriety. And they don't tell you, hey, would you like to do these tests to incriminate yourself? Because you can say no, and I can't do anything about it. If they told you that, everyone would say no.
Yeah.
So I think it's in the way it's framed. Voluntary searches operate in this gray area of the law where a person should really know their rights. The Constitution applies to all of us. Most people don't, and most people comply.
Welcome to Riding Counsel with Rich Jaffe, where the open road meets expert advice. I'm Richard Jaffe, an attorney and biking enthusiast, and this is where we dive into the world of motorcycling. Safety, culture, charitable giving, and riding right. So, whether you're a seasoned rider or just getting started, let's talk bikes, the road, and everything in between. Let's ride! Hello, Riding Counsel crew. Hello out there, and thanks a lot for joining us for this episode of the Riding Counsel podcast. I am your host, Rich Jaffe. I am a podcaster. I am a motorcycle enthusiast, and I am a personal injury lawyer who unfortunately represents a lot of motorcyclists involved in personal injury accidents at the hands of other people's negligence. Today, I have a great episode for everybody, and I wanted to bring you some knowledge all concerning what happens when a DWI occurs and all the circumstances surrounding that. And I figured I would bring somebody extremely knowledgeable on the subject. He's an attorney from Maryland, but he has knowledge about DWI in general. But for the most part, he's going to talk about things that are specific to his state because every state usually has different laws. And his name is Max Frizalone, attorney. And I wanted Max to tell all of you about himself more than I could because he's really quite accomplished. And Max, thanks a lot for coming on the show. Thanks for your time. Give us a 411. Who are you? Where are you? What do you do?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Rich. Like you said, I'm an attorney full-time, pretty much exclusively in the criminal traffic, so DUI and criminal offenses. I don't do anything else. I actually grew up in New York, went to school down in Miami, and then kind of landed on Maryland as a good split point between the two, where I really started practicing law full-time. Did a little stint as a public defender, a little stint as a prosecutor, and now I'm a full-time private criminal defense attorney. So I represent people for hire, essentially. Go ahead.
No, so you, what courts do you mostly practice in?
So for the most part, I practice in Maryland's district and circuit court. So these are our trial level courts at the state level. You won't find me in a federal court, and you won't find me in any other state, regardless of if I hold a bar there or not.
This episode has been brought to you by Riding Counsel. Don't forget to visit us at ridingcounsel.com. So you deal with a lot of DWI. Oh, let's be specific about what we're talking about, just so everybody's kind of on the same page. There's DWI and there's also DUI, and in many areas they could be considered two different things. Is that right?
That is, in my state, we have a two-tiered driving under the influence, driving while impaired statute. So we have a lesser offense that we like to call driving while impaired and a greater offense that we like to call driving under the influence. States have different names for it. There's like some states called like OVI, operating a vehicle impaired. Everybody kind of has their own, each state has their own criminal code and their own terminology. But I think for the purposes of today, we can pretty much talk about them interchangeably because one way or another, whether you're talking DWI, DUI, OVI, it's really going to come down to were you operating this vehicle and were you impaired or under the influence, however the law defines it.
All right. Well, I think we can all agree that operating a motorcycle under the influence of any kind of drug, or including alcohol, that would be a bad thing. I mean, we can all agree on that, right?
We can definitely agree on that. And, a lot of people are shocked to hear, picked juries on these kind of offenses before. They're shocked to hear that drinking and driving is not usually the crime, right? The crime is that drinking affecting your ability to drive. So when we talk about the impairment, that's the real problem. I mean, I'm not here to condone drinking and then getting behind the wheel of a vehicle or the handlebars of a motorcycle, but the crime is the impairment for the most part.
So when a police officer takes a look at a motorcyclist or even a regular driver of a regular car, they don't have some sort of ESP, some sort of brain power, and say, aha, that person is driving while intoxicated or something like that. Usually, I'd imagine that drivers of motorcycles get pulled over for reasons other than DWI initially, right? There has to be some sort of reasonable suspicion or probable cause. What is it that a police officer will usually pull over a motorcyclist for?
So I'll just start by saying that almost all motorcycle cases with DUI either occur from an accident or pursuant to a traffic stop. So we'll just isolate the traffic stops for this particular question. A lot of the time when you're stopped for a DUI, you're not initially stopped for a DUI. Tail light, tag light, no tag, not signaling vehicles, equipment violations, perhaps motorcycles. But yes, an officer needs a valid basis to stop you. And some of my cases resolve, let's say you're having a trial or a motions hearing. Some of my cases resolve very early on because they need a legal basis to stop the vehicle, whether it's a car or a motorcycle. And if absent one, there is no case usually.
Yeah, in New York, they tend to call that fruit of the poisonous tree. Is that true down in Maryland? Do they use that phrase at all?
There's a fruit of the poisonous tree. I think refers a lot of the Fourth Amendment stuff. Search and seizure. Fruit of the poisonous tree is common. I generally think probable cause RAS. Every state has had their own battle, frankly, grappling what legal standard we got to apply for a motor vehicle stop. But I generally think that fruit of the poisonous tree is an acceptable legal term to describe, stop and then whatever happens after it being illegal.
Yeah, so you mentioned a couple of things that I think is pretty relevant. You get pulled over maybe for a broken tail light or something that could be rather minor and then explodes into something big. But when you have a motorcycle and you're thinking about maybe one tail light out of all the tail lights are out, or maybe you're not using your blinker or something like that, it seems so small, but apparently it's a really good reason to make sure that your bike is in tip-top shape and good working order, so you don't get pulled over and you don't give anybody sort of probable cause to pull you over in the beginning.
I would absolutely agree with you because the highest courts in the United States have routinely said that the real reason you were stopped isn't what we care about. We call these Wren stops, the Wren case at U.S. Supreme Court. Even if the officer was profiling you for your, let's say, vest, if you committed a traffic infraction and you intend to challenge the basis for your stop in court and say, well, he really wanted me because I was wearing this or
Mm-hmm.
because I was in this area. They don't care. They need a legitimate basis, but that's all they need. From there forward, though, most, if not all, of my clients who have DUI cases talk too much and talk themselves into this DUI investigation because almost nobody declines to answer questions, although everybody has the right to do so.
you know I can understand the probable cause, if a police officer sees like a taillight out or something like that. But my problem, because I ride motorcycles, I love riding my Harley, but a lot of times if a motorcyclist gets tired, let's say, and maybe they're kind of swaying one way or the other, or maybe they're going too slow, or something small because of fatigue, and then they get pulled over, they're all of a sudden suspected of DWI. And that's the rub that I have. And I'm wondering if you've seen these kinds of cases where certain aspects of riding or maybe fatigue add to the suspicion of the police officer and kind of blow up into something else.
Well, I definitely think so. I mean, almost all of my DUI cases involve a case where an officer has a hunch and it turns into more than that. And the hunch can be based on a number of things. But driver fatigue can often look like you've just drank, right? If you have bags under your eyes, almost all of my reports are bloodshot, glossy eyes. Is the officer ever going to say that he knows a scientific reason why bloodshot eyes means somebody is impaired or had been drinking? No. All the officers are trained in the same thing that I've done, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's field sobriety test. And it's a big book. It's my office in the other room. And I can tell you it's got a lot of different reasons that you can come to when you're first in the personal contact phase of a DUI. So before we're even getting to the field sobriety, we're doing the license and registration part. We're past the vehicle in motion. So you stop the bicycle or the motorcycle and the car. A lot of the things that they're looking for can be attributed to not just tiredness, but also nervousness. A lot of fumbling with papers, not knowing where your registration is a car, let alone on a motorcycle. Fundamental nervousness can look a lot the same as somebody who's fundamentally been drinking. So I think that when you're at that initial stage of the case, before you're doing field sobriety, can tiredness look like drunkenness? Sure. Have I had trials where I had clients on long drives from states like the Northeast down to my state in Maryland? And have I successfully convinced judges that at least there's a doubt that that person was impaired based on that? Sure. At 3 a.m, if you don't have bloodshot eyes and you don't look tired and you're in a vehicle, then you better be working nights because everybody looks tired at 3 a.m who's driving.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I find motorcycle stops, or at least the ones I've been told about and ones I've seen, on video, they could get a very, very particular, let's say, because the police officer will come up to you and all of a sudden start shouting orders. And at least this is what I've seen and been told, get off the bike, or, take your keys out, throw them to the side, or, look, you need to I need your license. I need your registration. I need it now. They get a little demanding, maybe a little bit of an attitude. And I'm wondering if you've run into situations where police officers have said these kinds of things and, they sound like commands, but the driver really doesn't have to comply with what the officer is saying. Like, what do you do in that kind of situation?
Well, if you're operating a vehicle and you're stopped for a legitimate reason, license and registration, and perhaps depending on your state, also insurance information are required to be given. Can an officer ask you to step off of your bike? I actually think they probably can, in the same way that they have the right to ask you to step out of your vehicle in a routine traffic stop. And the Supreme Court has already gone through that issue before. Why do officers take such offense, particularly, I see, to people on motorcycles, but probably even more, especially to people on like sports styled motorcycles? Probably because they're so easy to flee on. I mean, it takes a car a long time to accelerate. I'll be honest, I'm not a motorcycle driver of much experience, but I do know that some of these, Gixxer is a common term. Some of these sports styled bikes can accelerate extremely fast and extremely quietly. So I think there's a lot of fear, especially when you're with highway officers who deal with, like, let's say, high speed chases all the time, or high speed drivers, that they want your keys. They want you stepping away from that bike as fast as possible because they've probably, and maybe it's happened, been sped off on, or someone that they know has been. So I think that's where that hostility comes from a lot. My general advice for my clients is to stop the vehicle when the lights are on, to give a license and registration or an insurance in my state if it's requested, and to give your name. Those are things you've got to give. But what you don't have to do is answer the where you coming from, where you going, how much have you had to drink. You don't have to answer those questions. And I usually advise people not to. Problem is, by the time they're talking to me, already been charged. So like only your second or third time, and by then the stakes can get very high.
Yeah, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you can, if you're pulled over, you can protest and say, look, I do not consent to a search, or, I don't want to do this, or I don't want to do that, and at least make it known. But I think the time to really fight these things is probably in court, as opposed to getting into a tussle with the police officer at the scene. What's your opinion there?
Well, I'm gonna defer to Snoop Dogg on this one. He said to park it like it's hot, and it sounds like a really good lyric, but it's actually sound legal advice. If the cops are trying to stop you, and you haven't done anything wrong, that's the time to fight that, is in court, not on the side of the road. I absolutely agree with you on that. Is there any benefit to being combative with the police? Even on the scene of a traffic stop? Usually, no. I mean, those clips that go viral, those people have to, people in the video, the ultimate defendant who's
Yeah.
probably illegally detained, illegally arrested, dragged out, they have to go through all that. Whereas they could just say nothing. The officer can ask you where you're coming from, where you're going. You could say, I don't want to answer any of your questions. What could? There's no offense of didn't answer my questions, wasn't polite to me. Those aren't criminal charges. But if you refuse to do things that you are legally required to do, you can very quickly turn what is a routine traffic stop into something much more. And it could even come with some frivolous driving under the influence, driving while impaired charge. As we were sitting here, I was thinking, what I said the Supreme Court says you have to get out of your car, and people are going to be like, that's not true. The case is Pennsylvania v. Mims, and you can be asked to step out of your vehicle. Now, how that applies to a motorcycle, you may have to take that to the current bench to get a solid answer. But I do believe asking somebody to step off their motorcycle would be treated the same as asking someone to step out of their vehicle. But again, it can't be like for 45 minutes, but for long enough to process your tickets, it sounds like fair game to me under that, that opinion for the court.
And just fair disclosure also, and a disclaimer that a lot of things that we're talking about, first of all, it's not legal advice. Second of all, if we're talking about laws, it may apply to Maryland. It very likely does not apply to another state. Just want to throw that out there because there's a lot of different laws, whether or not it's state or federal or Parks Department, who knows, but these are just general ideas. And I just want to throw that out there just in case.
Sure. I make a lot of content online about DUI, and I regularly remind people that this is a Maryland specific thing. Like, for example, I'm a member of the National College for DUI Defense. We have lawyers in every state, and they're routinely ask questions to each other, and it has exposed me to how different law is in other states. In some states, I believe they're drawing people's blood on the side of the road, like the officer's a phlebotomist. That is not a Maryland thing. So like when I say you don't have to answer questions, that's a uniform thing. I've actually polled on the second thing I'll bring up, which is standardized field sobriety tests. Is there any state that punishes you for refusing to do standardized field sobriety tests? The answer that I have gotten from the other attorneys I've spoken with is generally no. However, it's different in every state whether or not the prosecutor, when you go to court, can use your refusal against you as evidence. Like, he didn't want to do the walk and turn one leg stand, and he didn't want to do horizontal gaze because he was impaired. Some states will and some states won't, I understand, allow prosecutors to use that type of evidence. Now, once you're placed under arrest, or if a breath test is requested through whatever your state statute is for requesting a breath test after either arrest for DUI, suspicion DUI, however they frame it. Now, refusing that has different penalties in nearly every state. So that's where I'll say, don't take my Maryland advice of whether or not to blow and apply that to your Hawaii or Colorado or Maine case. But generally speaking, not giving police not giving police evidence against you is a legal thing in every state.
Right. You bring up a couple of really important things to talk about. One is you were mentioning what a field sobriety test, the sort of the do's and don'ts in there. But let's just take a step back and let's just be clear. Can you just tell us what is a field sobriety test as it is out in the field, administered by a police officer in the field?
Sure. So these field sobriety tests are really standardized by the NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And every officer, whether they're in, California or Florida, generally receives the same curriculum because these are standardized and generally applies the same roadside tests under this framework. These are the ones that the NHTSA is sticking their neck out on and saying we have our studies, and my lawyers might have problems with them. These are the ones we say are validated. So the first test in the standardized field sobriety test is a horizontal gaze and nystagmus. You sometimes would see somebody, I'm looking around here for a pen, using a pen, like one of these, holding a stimulus out in front of you, dragging it in front of your eyes. But you're trying to figure out, what are they looking for? They're actually looking for this thing called nystagmus. It's an involuntary movement of your pupil, and it occurs for a variety of reasons. My state says, I think, 77 different reasons, but one of them is consumption of alcohol. The remaining two tests are the walk and turn test. That's that funny looking kind of like foot in front of other foot walk. No one walks like that. It's got this weird turn with a series of small steps around it. And that and the one leg stand, holding out your leg and counting, those are balancing tests. So generally, these three tests are designed to give the officer evidence that he can use then to form his probable cause to arrest you for whatever offense you're in, OWI, DWI, DUI. So there's different clues for each test. The instructions are standardized. So in the same way that I had to give them to my instructor, the officer who's on the side of the road with you should be giving them to you. And the clues that they're looking for, they don't tell you what they're looking for, but they're looking for a variety of different clues, which they then ultimately will use to form their opinion, which most of the time is the alcohol was affecting him, and that's why I arrested him. So that is why I generally advise people that you don't need to do them. I tell my clients, don't do them. The cases where my clients don't do them are shorter and usually contain less evidence before the arrest.
I can't think of any reason, if you are suspected of DWI and you're asked to do a field sobriety test, why anyone would actually do a field sobriety test. I mean, unless you're really compelled to do so by law. I'm not aware of any state that compels you to do a field sobriety test in the field by law, but certainly in New York, you're not compelled to do it. And I don't know why anybody really would. So I think your advice is spot on, if I may say. If you don't have to do it, then don't do a field sobriety test. It turns into, if there's not a camera around that's actually filming the actual field sobriety test, it's your word against theirs. And even with a camera, it still could be very questionable.
Yeah, my state, every officer pretty much uniform was wearing body worn camera at this point, especially on roadside stops. So I'd say everything's on video. That's what I expect when someone comes in and meets with me. What I will say is I absolutely agree with you. Why do people do them? I think people want to comply. The officers don't exactly tell you don't have to do it, right? The way that they ask is the same way that they ask to search your vehicles. I'll start with that. Anything in here illegal, that I should know about? No. That's what everyone says, no, right? Because the answer is always no. And then the officer says, well, you wouldn't mind if I looked then, right? Now, if you say, yeah, I would mind if you looked, you're someone who knows your rights. And that's not going to be, that's not going to hurt you. But most people default to, no, I don't mind if you look. And that's how they get inside your vehicle. It's the same way with field sobriety. Yeah, you have an athlete drink, you're safe to drive, right? So you don't mind going through a few tests with me over here in front of my vehicle. Just make sure you're safe to drive. Sometimes they say, we're just going to do field sobriety. They don't tell you, hey, would you like to do these tests to incriminate yourself? Because you can say no, and I can't do anything about it. If they told you that, everyone would say no.
Yeah.
So I think it's in the way it's framed. Voluntary searches operate in this gray area of the law where a person should really know their rights. The Constitution applies to all of us. Most people don't, and most people comply.
So the other big thing that police officers seem to want to do in the field is a breathalyzer. And I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about, the breathalyzer machine and its accuracy or lack thereof, and maybe how it's used.
So generally on the field, we see preliminary breath tests, handheld units. You go to Target, you can buy one. I'm sure the officers have a better unit than one you can get at Target. My state doesn't allow those to be used in court. So when you're offered one in Maryland, the officer tells you, well, I can't use this in court, but why don't you just blow it anyway? Help me, just for my own edification. And the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says, the officer can use it as sort of like a learning tool. But what really happens more often than not is if you're in a close call situation and you're that officer, you're asking for the PBT, and you're thinking, am I going to be right or wrong? And if it's a 0, you might let the person go, right? Or you might swap to now they're on drugs. But if it's a 0.13, then you're making the right move. So I think as much as it is confirmatory, if you can't use it in court, why are you asking people to do it? So I always recommend, again, against taking a PBT, as long as your state, the officer is required to tell you it can't be used in court, what's the benefit? I don't see one.
Yeah, I could tell you here in New York, at least, if the police officer are in the field, meaning they're issuing you a ticket or investigating right on the scene, you can refuse a breathalyzer test at the scene. But if they then arrest you and then bring you down to the precinct and then they ask you to do a breathalyzer, that's when you cannot refuse. Or you can refuse, but you have pretty harsh penalties that you face. You lose your license and you have a bunch of inferences against you in court. So I guess every state is different how they approach things.
Yeah, and I'll be clear. The preliminary breath test, the roadside one, is the one we don't allow in court. But the test at the station, here we use Intox ECIR machines. Those are admissible in court.
Mm-hmm.
And refusal to blow into one of those does create a negative inference, does come with some additional licensing consequences, most of which have been nullified by the additional licensing consequences of getting convicted or receiving a break on a DUI in my state anyway. But that blow at the station is generally admissible. In my state, there isn't as much of a benefit as there used to be to providing a breath sample. We used to have some licensing benefits to blowing between a 0.18 and 0.15. Now those have that they calling it a loophole has been closed because everybody who gets a conviction or probation before judgment, which is a judge striking a conviction for a DUI offense in Maryland, has to have an interlock on their vehicle anyway. So they've taken away a lot of the usefulness for the attractiveness of the offer of blowing at the station. But every state, some states have a standalone offense for refusing to blow in a machine. So could be one of those cases where you lose on just that. You might not be DUI, but you're going to lose on that no matter what if you say no, right? Because that might be like
So let's say you're trucking down on your motorcycle and you get pulled over for DWI and you get arrested for DWI. What happens to the motorcycle? What do they do to it?
So, I have to imagine it's getting towed, especially if you're on a highway in this circumstance. So generally impound, usually when a vehicle is towed, in my experience, police officers will give you a tow slip. They'll call an independent tow agency. Some of the police agencies have like a rotating wheel or a preferred vendor sort of situation, and they'll tow it. And as long as they're not interested in getting a search warrant to open your, back flap area or anything like that, probably just release it to you once you have been released from your case. And in my state, a period of time has passed for you to sober up.
So a lot of times, or in a lot of places, I have heard that once your car is towed or your motorcycle is towed or even impounded, that the police officers can actually do what they call a safety check or a safety inventory and go through everything. So they can go in your saddlebags and they can go in the crevices of the motorcycle to, I guess, make sure that it's safe or take inventory to make sure that they're keeping everything. And that's where things, I guess, could really mushroom out of control if you have something illegal in there. Is that something that happens in your state?
So this will be just general Fourth Amendment law. You've got two different areas here. You've got searches and then you have inventories. Inventories are not treated as searches under the law, but searches, like for example, incident to an arrest. If you're placed under arrest for DUI, DWI, whatever offense, generally I would expect that police officers are allowed to search your vehicle, including your motorcycle. Looking for evidence of the DUI. It'd be very easy to go to court as an officer and say, well, they sell alcohol in bottles this big. I needed to search the vehicle to see if there was evidence of the DUI. So I think that they do have a basis to search your vehicle. Now, an inventory, it also occurs sometimes when a vehicle's towed. Let's say you were not on your bicycle or your motorcycle at the time of your DUI arrest for whatever reason, and they are going to tow it from wherever it is. An inventory is sort of another way to look inside of a vehicle without saying I'm looking, right? The purpose of an inventory is to make sure that what is in your car at the time it's towed is what is in your car when you're going to get it back. So it's really supposed to be done standardized according to whatever the police agency's guidelines are. And they're supposed to say, okay, I'm creating a log. You should get an inventory log, a pair of goggles, pair of gloves, yesterday's sandwich, $3. You're supposed that's what an inventory is for, so that when you go pick up your bike, my half a sandwich and my gloves are still there. Or if they're not there, tow yard, somebody took my gloves. So that's what an inventory is. But I would expect most of the time, if you're arrested for a DUI, I know for certain in my state, but in most other states, you should expect the police officers are able to search your vehicle incident to that arrest, as a part of that arrest.
So you also used the term before. I think you used it actually as it pertains to vehicles, meaning cars, and that's an interlock device. I'm wondering if you are convicted of DWI, is there an interlock type device for a motorcycle? And maybe you could just talk about what an interlock device really is.
Sure. So an interlock device, and there are lots of different names for them, but interlock's like a commonly used one. Lots of different companies that sell them are generally devices that are installed usually on the starter of a vehicle. So a gas vehicle, they're easier to install. Electric vehicles, they're starting to figure out how to install them too. It's a device that controls when you can turn on your car, and it requires you to provide a breath sample at the time you're turning on your car, but then also in a rolling retest fashion. So while you're driving, you need to blow into the thing. So, based on the way it operates, I can tell you for certain there's no way they're putting one on a motorcycle. There's about a zero chance. I'm sure that some states have probably even made it illegal to have them on motorcycles. It would be extremely dangerous to be driving a motorcycle and have to Whoa. You also would never hear it because it beeps and tells you, hey, rolling retest time. You could never hear it. I mean, on your, I don't know what kind of Harley you have, but I haven't heard a quiet Harley in my entire life. So, yeah, it controls the power to your vehicle. It stops you from being able to turn your vehicle on or continue to operate your vehicle, and requires you to give breath samples while driving. In my state, many people install them before they're even convicted, right? And the person may never get convicted and still have to install one because we confiscate your license in my state. We give you an order of suspension for a breath test over our limit. And we say, hey, you've got 45 days before you're suspended, and here's a few options. In 10 days, you can ask to go in front of an administrative law judge and challenge whether or not there are reasonable grounds to ask for that breath sample, what the sample was, etc. Or you got 30 days to put that ignition interlock on your vehicle and keep it on your vehicle for 6 months or a year or perhaps more if you have priors. So that's what an interlock device is. That's how soon you might have to get one in my state, and definitely can't put one on a motorcycle.
Wow. Max, look, you gave us so much information today about DWI, and I hope nobody ever gets pulled over, let alone arrested or convicted of DWI. I'm sure we can all agree that it's not a good idea, definitely not recommended. But I'd love to discuss some more topics with you when it comes to DWI and the ramifications of it. I just don't have any more time for this episode, but I really wanted to thank you for your time and your expertise. And just in case people have a problem and they need to get in touch with you, because it's always good to have an attorney in these kinds of situations, how do we find you? How do we get to you?
So you can find me on the internet. If you just go to Google and you type in our firm information, Friz Woods, because Frizalone is quite a name. That'll take you to our website. We have 24-hour consultation line. You can give us a call. You can submit a form. You can schedule your own call. We are extremely accessible. That's what we pride ourselves on. And if you do have a case in Maryland, we'd be happy to help.
Do you have a phone number that you'd like to publicize?
Sure, you can give us a call, 301-720-1917.
And the website is FRIZWOODS.com.
Yep, .com.
Okay, and if it's okay with you, Max, I'm going to put all that information down here in the comment section for YouTube, and for everybody who is just listening and not watching on YouTube, you have the information. And if you do need further information about Max, you can always contact me as well. Of course, I'm Rich Jaffe from Riding Counsel. It's RIDINGCOUNSEL.com, ridingcounsel.com. But in the meantime, this is all the time we're going to have for this episode. And thanks again for Max for dropping so much knowledge on us, and really appreciate that. And until next episode, I want everybody out there to ride free, stay wild and crazy, but just in a legal way. Take care, everybody. And that's a wrap for this episode of Riding Counsel with Richard Jaffe. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the ride, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share with your fellow riders. Until next time, keep the rubber side down and ride safe.